How did a regiment so small that its entire fighting strength fits inside a single sports stadium produce the unit that America's most lethal special operations force explicitly modeled itself on? How did men from a country of 67 million, operating under a government that officially refuses to confirm their existence, become the standard against which every other special forces unit on Earth measures its own performance? How did a force whose selection course kills candidates outright, not by ending careers, but by exposure and exhaustion in the Welsh mountains, develop a method of entering and clearing a fortified building that left United States Marines among the finest infantry in human history, searching for language adequate to describe what they had watched? And how did the fighters inside a Taliban compound in Helmand province in 2007 understand, in the fraction of a second, between the door coming off its hinges and everything going dark, that what had just entered their building was something for which they had no preparation and no answer? Forget what you think you know about British military capability. What you are about to discover explains not just what happened in Helmand. It explains why America built its most dangerous unit by studying the British, and why the men who emerged from that process watched their teachers operate in Afghanistan and concluded, in the direct language of professionals who do not give compliments lightly, that these guys are built different. Stay until the final section, because the detail buried in the operational record of Task Force 42 is the part that changes everything you thought you understood about what a human being can be trained to do. And it is the part that explains everything that came before it. Tell me in the comments, did you know Delta Force was deliberately modeled on the British SAS? Because most people do not. And that fact is the foundation of everything that follows. To understand what the Marines were watching, you first need to understand the specific problem they were watching it solve. A compound in Helmand province in the late years of the first decade of this century was not an abstraction. It was a mud-walled structure of multiple rooms arranged around an interior courtyard, with walls thick enough to stop rifle rounds, with interior geometry completely unknown to anyone entering it for the first time, with improvised explosive devices potentially placed at every threshold, with defenders who had lived in these structures for years and knew every doorway's angle of approach, and with the additional complexity that women and children might occupy rooms adjacent to armed fighters. The problem was not simply tactical, it was geometric, psychological, and moral simultaneously, and it had to be resolved in the time it takes a human being to process a threat and raise a weapon. United States Marines in Helmand cleared compounds. They were professional, rehearsed, and effective. Their doctrine involved graduated entry, threat assessment, close air support planning, and controlled escalation designed to protect both the mission and the men executing it. That doctrine was the product of the finest infantry training system in the American military, refined through sustained combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan across more than a decade. It was not a weak standard. It was an exceptional standard. What the Marines watched Task Force 42 do occupied a categorically different operational space. The men who came through that door had been selected by a process designed to eliminate 9 in 10 of the best soldiers who attempted it. They had trained for years in a facility specifically built to compress the time between entry and threat neutralization to seconds per room. They had conducted hundreds of compound entries in actual combat before this one, at a tempo that turned trained skill into physical reflex. When the Marines looked at their watches afterward and looked at each other, the number did not fit inside any reference point they had available. It did not make sense against everything they knew about what the problem required. The phrase that emerged from those observations is the phrase this script is built around. But the phrase is not where the story starts. The story starts in a Cairo hospital in July 1941, with a broken-legged Scottish aristocrat and 2 pages of handwritten proposal that changed what the world understood about what soldiers could be. Lieutenant David Stirling of the Scots Guards was 6 feet and 5 inches tall, a pre-war art student who had broken his leg during an unauthorized parachute practice jump. That choice encapsulated both his recklessness and his fundamental conviction that the only way to determine whether something was possible was to attempt it and observe the result. Lying in hospital with months of recovery ahead and a war proceeding without him, he wrote a memo. Its argument was simple, and it was the most consequential military argument made by any individual in the 20th century. Small, highly trained raiding parties, inserted deep behind enemy lines, could achieve strategic effects that entire brigades could not, at a fraction of the cost, at far greater speed, and with far less vulnerability. Mass was not the answer. Selection was. The first operation, in November 1941, was near total disaster. 65 men parachuted into high winds in the North African desert. Only 22 returned, and equipment containers were lost. Jock Lewis, who had invented the incendiary device the unit would use to destroy enemy aircraft on the ground, was killed during the withdrawal by an Italian fighter. Stirling concluded not that the theory was wrong, but that the insertion method was wrong and that everything else was right. The second operation, transported overland by the Long-Range Desert Group, attacked 3 Axis airfields in Libya and destroyed 60 aircraft without a single casualty in a single night by men who 2 weeks earlier had suffered near complete annihilation. That ratio, strategic effect, achieved after catastrophic failure by men who reconsidered the method rather than the mission, established the template that would define British Special Forces across 8 decades and 4 continents. It is worth pausing on that ratio. 60 aircraft destroyed, 0 SAS casualties, by men whose previous operation had produced one of the worst casualty rates of the entire North African campaign. The lesson Stirling drew was the lesson his successors never modified. Selection determined everything, and the right 20 men would consistently outperform the wrong 200 in ways that made the comparison almost meaningless. Before the selection process produced the men who would deploy to Afghanistan, it produced something else. In November 2001, 7 weeks after the September 11th attacks, and less than a month into the invasion of Afghanistan, a squadron and G Squadron of 22nd SAS were given a mission that demonstrated in the most direct possible terms what the system was designed to produce. The target was an al-Qaeda-linked opium processing plant and command center approximately 300 kilometers southwest of Kandahar, 12 miles from the Pakistani border, at the foot of the Koh-e-Malik mountain. Between 80 and 100 foreign fighters defended it from fortified bunkers, trenches, and caves. United States Central Command had mandated a full daylight assault because air support assets were available only during a 1-hour afternoon window. No prior reconnaissance of the site was possible within the given timelines. The commanding officer of 22nd SAS, Lieutenant Colonel Ed Butler, was presented with a mission any reasonable officer could have returned on grounds of undue hazard. He accepted it. The assault force drove 120 miles from an improvised desert airstrip in 38 Land Rover vehicles and 8 motorcycles, through fine desert dust that reduced visibility to near nothing. One vehicle broke down, and its 3-man crew stayed with it, recovered on the way out. The assault force arrived, split into its assault and fire support elements, and went forward against a position defended by men who had seen them coming across 120 miles of open desert and had prepared accordingly. What followed was not a clean engagement. The al-Qaeda fighters were not skilled soldiers, but they were not afraid to die, which made them more dangerous than skilled soldiers who wished to survive. One SAS trooper was hit and went down. Two of his colleagues ran forward under fire, dragged him clear, and continued the fight. An SAS officer took 2 rounds in his ceramic body armor and a third in his water bottle and kept moving. The regimental sergeant major commanding the fire support base advanced to reinforce the assault when he believed progress was stalling, was shot in the leg by a Kalashnikov round, and continued to direct operations. A squadron eventually penetrated the cave entrances and cleared what was inside. In one cave, they found 3 fighters sleeping who reached for their weapons when woken and did not reach them in time. 4 SAS soldiers were wounded. None were killed. Unverified accounts place the Al-Qaeda dead at 73. A participant described the defenders as men for whom surrender was the last thing on their minds. Fighters who ran out of the front line firing as if it were the First World War. Some men who would not be taken alive and who made that preference clear at every opportunity. 5 medals were awarded for actions during the operation. 1 Distinguished Service Order, 2 Navy Crosses, and 2 Conspicuous Gallantry Crosses, the second highest combat gallantry award the British military can bestow, below only the Victoria Cross. The men who received those medals returned to Hereford and said nothing publicly. That silence is part of the same institutional identity as the selection and the training. No names, no ceremony, only the result. To understand what produced those men and what was being built in parallel for the operators who would later deploy to Helmand as Task Force 42, you need to understand what selection actually requires of the human beings who attempt it. 200 men arrive at Sennybridge training camp in Wales twice yearly, in summer and in winter. Everyone has already passed the basic fitness standards of the British Army. Everyone comes from a regiment where physical excellence is the baseline rather than the achievement. They are not civilians attempting something difficult. They are already exceptional soldiers attempting something specifically designed to break them, and which breaks 9 out of 10 of them. Fewer than 20 will finish. The others will not be weak men. They will simply not be what 22nd SAS requires. The first phase takes place in the Brecon beacons. Loads increase week by week. Navigation runs are conducted alone. No instructors shout encouragement. No teammates carry the weight that belongs to you. Former Sergeant Andy McNabb, one of the regiment's most publicly known veterans, stated that by the end of the Hills phase, his group had gone from 220 candidates to 24. 24. From 220. The attrition is not a side effect of the design. It is the design. The directing staff are not trying to make selection harder than it needs to be. They are trying to identify a very specific kind of person, and the only reliable method of identification is to create conditions under which that person either reveals themselves or does not. The culmination of this phase is an event officially designated endurance, known throughout the regiment as the Long Drag. 64 kilometers across the Brecon beacons, carrying a loaded Bergen of 25 kilograms, not including water, food, and rifle, to be completed in under 20 hours. Navigation by map and compass alone, without established trails, without GPS, without external confirmation that the direction being walked is the correct one. This comes at the end of 4 weeks, during which the body has already been systematically degraded by accumulated fatigue, so that the final test occurs at the exact moment the candidate has the fewest physical resources remaining. In 2013, 3 soldiers died during a selection exercise in these hills. Between 2014 and 2022, deaths in SAS training and exercises exceeded deaths in combat against armed opponents. This is not a failure of the system. This is the calibration level that 22nd SAS considers acceptable in identifying the men it needs. The isolation is deliberate, and the reason for it is specific. An SAS patrol operates for weeks behind enemy lines in four-man teams, without external support, in conditions designed to produce failure, making decisions that cannot be referred upward and cannot be deferred. A candidate who needs encouragement to continue cannot survive that environment. A candidate who needs another person's confirmation to make the correct decision will not be in a position to make it when the decision is required. The long drag is therefore a psychological test with a physical component. The physical component is designed to be at the exact limit of human endurance, so that the psychological test occurs under conditions where quitting is not just tempting, but genuinely rational. The men who do not quit are not men for whom the argument against continuing seemed weak. They are men for whom the argument was entirely clear and present, and who continued anyway, alone, without anyone watching, for reasons that existed entirely inside themselves. After the Hills phase comes 14 weeks of tactics and weapons training at Stirling Lines in Hereford, covering advanced weapons handling, demolitions, close target reconnaissance, vehicle handling, close-quarter combat, and the handling of foreign weapons systems used by adversaries. Then jungle training in Brunei or Belize, where candidates are placed in four-man patrols and tested on their ability to apply everything they have learned in conditions of heat, humidity, and persistent physical discomfort. Then combat survival and resistance to interrogation. By the end of full selection and continuation training, 200 candidates have become roughly 25. Those 25 go to operational squadrons, where the real education begins. Accumulated knowledge of decades of operations, passed directly between operators, in a regiment that has been conducting this work without interruption since the Second World War. At Stirling Lines, there is a building officially designated the Close Quarter Battle House, known throughout the regiment as the Killing House. It is 2 stories high, with 4 rooms on each floor, movable partitions to reconfigure the interior layout between exercises, rubber-coated walls to absorb live rounds, extractor fans to clear gun smoke, and closed-circuit cameras in every corner, recording the action for post-exercise analysis and debriefing. Live ammunition is used. Operators enter rooms and engage targets in the time it takes a human being to process a threat and raise a weapon. The training was developed in the 1970s, following the Munich Olympics massacre of 1972, when the absence of dedicated counter-terrorist capability across Western militaries became impossible to ignore and equally impossible to justify. The stun grenade, now deployed by every special forces unit in the world with a hostage rescue role, was invented by the SAS and first used operationally in October 1977, when 2 British SAS advisors assisted the German counter-terrorist unit GSG-9 in recovering hostages from a hijacked Lufthansa aircraft at Mogadishu, Somalia. The concept of the purpose-built training house for live-fire close-quarter drills has been adopted by Delta Force at Fort Bragg, by the FBI's hostage rescue team at Quantico, by Israeli Special Forces, and by Norwegian Special Operations units. The template was British. The copies came later, and the copies knew they were copies. On the 5th of May 1980, in full view of international television cameras broadcasting live across the globe, 22nd SAS assaulted the Iranian embassy in London. 17 minutes. 5 of the 6 hostage-takers killed, all but 1 of the hostages rescued. No other special forces unit in the world had, at that point, performed an equivalent operation with those results, under those conditions, in front of that audience. 35 years before the Helmand deployments, the SAS demonstrated publicly what the training produced. The standard was set then. It had not been lowered. By the time a squadron deployed to Iraq under Task Force Black in 2004, the Killing House drills had been refined across 3 decades of live-fire practice. What followed in Iraq added something no training environment could ever fully simulate: operational tempo at a scale that turned rehearsed skill into physical reflex. General Stanley McChrystal, commanding the Joint Special Operations Task Force in Iraq, documented that a squadron of 22nd SAS conducted 175 combat missions during a single 6-month tour of duty. 175 in 183 days. The gap between trained skill and operational reflex, the gap that creates hesitation, something that produces errors in the seconds between a threat appearing and a response being formulated, had effectively closed to something approaching zero. The killing house had prepared the nervous system. Iraq had converted that preparation into instinct. The province those operators were eventually redeployed to, after British withdrawal from Iraq in 2009 released additional squadrons for Afghanistan, was not a place that rewarded anything less than that level of preparation. Helmand province is the largest province in Afghanistan, covering approximately 58,000 square kilometers of territory. It produced, at the time of the British deployment, roughly half of the world's opium supply. The United Nations estimated that the Taliban earned $300 million per year from the drug trade in the province alone. A leaked National Security Agency document concluded that the insurgents could not be defeated without disrupting it. From October 2008, NATO defense ministers formally declared drug trafficking networks legitimate military targets for international forces, placing Task Force 42's mission at the intersection of counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, and counter-narcotics simultaneously. Those three categories do not simplify each other. They complicate each other in ways that make every decision harder and every error more consequential. The British arrived in April 2006 with 3,300 personnel built around the 3rd Battalion Parachute Regiment. The pre-British international presence in Helmand had been approximately 130 American soldiers conducting limited anti-terrorism missions. That figure represents what the coalition had, until that point, considered adequate for the province. The stated mission was reconstruction-focused. Within weeks, the reality was sustained combat operations against a Taliban insurgency that had owned Helmand for years and saw no reason to share it in response to the arrival of 3,000 foreign soldiers. Sangin district in central Helmand accounted for a quarter of all British deaths in Afghanistan across the full campaign. The Fusiliers who relieved Royal Marines there in early 2007 were attacked 79 times in their first 20 days, nearly 4 engagements per day, and from a force embedded in the population and the terrain in ways that firepower alone could not resolve. A compound in Sangin was simultaneously a structure, a fighting position, a weapons cache, and a command node. The improvised explosive devices that bomb-making networks planted at thresholds and along approach routes made every movement toward a fortified building a calculation about acceptable risk. 448 British service personnel died in Afghanistan across the full campaign. Most of them died in Helmand. Into this environment, the British government deployed a formation that Prime Minister Gordon Brown publicly confirmed numbered close to 500 personnel. This was an extraordinary statement from a government whose stated policy is that it does not comment on special forces operations. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom named a number. The political pressure that produced that admission tells you something about the scrutiny the operations were under, and about the scale of what those 500 were being asked to accomplish in a province that had resisted every previous attempt to change it. The formation was Task Force 42. Its existence was confirmed by the WikiLeaks release of the Afghanistan war logs in 2010. Its core was the Special Boat Service, the Royal Navy's Special Operations Regiment, which shares a selection process and capability standard with the SAS and had been the primary United Kingdom Special Forces element in Afghanistan since 2001. The SBS was augmented by the Special Reconnaissance Regiment, which collected human and signals intelligence to develop and confirm targets before action was taken, by the Special Forces Support Group, a tri-service unit built around the 1st Battalion Parachute Regiment, providing blocking forces and quick reaction elements during direct action missions, and by reserve elements from the territorial SAS regiments. After the British drawdown from Iraq in 2009, 2 full squadrons of 22nd SAS redeployed to Afghanistan and substantially reinforced the task force. Task Force 42 operated against a targeting system known as the Joint Prioritized Effects List, a classified coalition document containing 2,058 names by October 2009. Bomb makers, financiers, district-level Taliban commanders, drug barons, whose networks provided the funding that bought the materials that built the roadside devices that killed soldiers on patrol. Coalition forces were authorized to kill or capture every individual named on the list. The pace of operations it generated was 90 raids per month across the coalition's special forces in late 2009, up from 20 raids per month just 6 months earlier. John Noggle, a former counterinsurgency advisor to General David Petraeus, described the overall campaign as an almost industrial-scale counter-terrorism killing machine. American Special Operations focused on the highest priority targets. The senior leadership at the Joint Special Operations Command had designated its primary responsibility. Task Force 42 operated against mid-level targets, the Taliban district commanders, on bomb-making cell facilitators and network nodes whose removal disrupted the system below the senior leadership level. Removing them did not end the insurgency. The Taliban replaced every lost commander, as every military organization replaces its casualties. But the disruption to the networks that assembled the devices, coordinated the ambushes, and moved money and fighters across the province was measurable, and its effect on the men who patrolled those roads was measurable in the same units. The finding that defined Task Force 42's standing in the coalition community is contained in the WikiLeaks data. When the Afghanistan war logs generated significant international controversy in 2010, much of it centered on civilian deaths attributed to American Special Operations Forces conducting operations against the same target list. Analysts examining the same records specifically for Task Force 42 operations found no evidence of civilian deaths in any released UKSF action. This covers only what was released, and what was released does not represent the complete operational record. But for the period it covers, the distinction is documented, and it was noted. The task force had paid its own price. In June 2006, 2 SBS operators were killed when their vehicle was ambushed, following a successful raid in the Sangin Valley. In July 2007, a further SBS commando was killed during a direct action mission near the Iranian border. He was cited posthumously in the British press as a secret hero, which is the closest the British Special Forces establishment comes to public recognition of what its operators sacrifice in operations that cannot be officially acknowledged. The missions did not pause. They were never scheduled to pause. In February 2008, the SBS intercepted the Taliban commander Mullah Dadullah, along with his lieutenant and a bodyguard, as they crossed the desert on motorcycles, operators deploying rapidly from helicopters across the convoy's path and cutting it off before it reached cover. In October 2008, Operation Beethoven 5 resulted in 4 enemy killed in action. In November 2008, Army Air Corps Apache helicopters called in by task force operators killed 3 insurgents, including a listed target. Each of these operations appears in the released war logs as a brief administrative entry, stated in the flat procedural language of military after-action reporting. That brevity is its own form of testimony. This was the operational baseline, not the exceptional event. But before any of that, before the surge of United States Marines into Helmand that would create the conditions for the American reaction at the center of this script, there was the operation that demonstrated what British Special Forces were capable of at maximum difficulty. There was the hunt for Mullah Dadullah, and Dadullah was, by any assessment that honest analysts were willing to apply, the most dangerous individual operating in Afghanistan. He was born in 1966, an ethnic Pashtun from Kandahar province, when he lost his left leg fighting Soviet forces during the occupation of the 1980s, earning the nickname Lang, meaning lame, in the same tradition as Timur the Great, who was also known by that name for a similar wound. He had been relieved of Taliban command at least twice by Mullah Omar himself, for conduct that exceeded even Taliban standards of acceptable violence. His fellow commanders called him the Butcher, not Western analysts, not his enemies, but the men who fought alongside him and found his methods excessive by the standards of a movement not known for restraint. He sat on the Taliban Shura Majlis, the Executive Council, and was among Mullah Omar's most trusted senior advisors. He was the architect of the Taliban suicide bombing campaign across Afghanistan and the operational commander of Taliban military activity across 4 southern provinces: Helmand, Kandahar, Uruzgan, and Zabul. A Taliban commander recalled in 2014, "When Dadullah was alive, half of Helmand was in Taliban hands. No one would ever dare wrong him. He would tell people that either they captured an area or they were not to return to him." Locating him had been a sustained intelligence effort. He communicated through intermediaries, moved carefully, and maintained the security habits of a man who understood that his prominence made him a primary target, and who had survived long enough to understand what that required in practice. The breakthrough came not from a single source of intelligence, but from an operation that stands as one of the most effective pieces of intelligence tradecraft in the documented record of the entire Afghan campaign. In March 2007, Italian journalist Daniele Mastrogiacomo was held hostage by the Taliban. His release was negotiated in exchange for 5 senior Taliban prisoners, including a brother of Dadullah and several other significant commanders. The exchange appeared to the watching world as capitulation, a government paying the price that terrorist demands required. The appearance was not the reality. The released Taliban commanders were provided with gifts before returning to their organization, telephones and laptops of the kind that men freed from imprisonment might plausibly receive and appreciate. For the gifts had been fitted by the American Signals Intelligence Unit known as Task Force Orange, with tracking devices sophisticated enough to continue transmitting as the commanders moved back through the Taliban network. Their satellite phone communications were simultaneously monitored. Intelligence from both sources was cross-referenced, filtered, and gradually resolved into a specific location: a compound at Bahram Chah in southern Helmand province, close to the border with Pakistan. The operational problem was immediate and specific. The compound at Bahram Chah was not an open terrain where an airstrike could be safely executed. It was surrounded by civilian habitation. An airstrike was ruled out because the risk to the surrounding population made it unacceptable, and a Hellfire missile fired from a helicopter carried the same constraint. The mission required operators on the ground, entering a structure whose interior geometry was unknown to them, engaging armed fighters inside it, and positively identifying the target before any confirmation of a kill could be made. It required close-quarter battle at night against a security detail of experienced Taliban fighters inside a building that was designed, by its occupants, to be defended. C Squadron of the Special Boat Service was assigned the mission. The SAS was primarily committed to Iraq at this point. The SBS had the capability, the operational experience in Helmand, and the specific training that this situation demanded. The mission was designated Operation Tetris. On the evening of the 11th of May 2007, SAS squadron boarded helicopters. They had a confirmed compound location. They had signals intelligence placing Dadullah inside it for a meeting with other senior commanders. They had the accumulated experience of operators who had been conducting direct action missions in Afghanistan since 2001, in conditions that had converted years of deliberate training into the kind of physical reflex that only sustained combat repetition produces. What followed was not a clean or rapid engagement. Available accounts describe hours of fighting in darkness, inside and around the compound, against fighters who knew the structure and were prepared to defend it at any cost. The operators moved with night vision equipment, exploiting an advantage their training had specifically prepared them to use. They encountered organized resistance that required sustained, close engagement rather than the overwhelming immediate suppression that a perfectly executed surprise allows. Hours of fighting in confined spaces by men on both sides who were fully committed to the outcome is not a description of a clean operation. It is a description of what years of training in the killing house and hundreds of previous compound entries were designed to sustain a man through, not just into the first room, but through every room, under fire, for as long as the mission required. Mullah Dadullah was shot twice in the torso and once in the back of the head. 2 rounds to the center of mass, then the confirmation shot to the head. The signature of Special Forces termination procedure, performed by operators for whom the sequence had been repeated thousands of times in training and hundreds of times in actual operations before this one. Whether the fatal shots were fired by an SBS operator or by one of the American-trained Afghan forces participating in the mission was not definitively established by subsequent reporting. What was not disputed was the wound pattern, and the body itself served as its own confirmation. The following morning, Governor Asadullah Khalid of Kandahar province displayed the body to journalists at his official residence. An Associated Press reporter who had seen Dadullah in previous Taliban-released recordings recognized him from the specific configuration of his remaining limbs. No left leg, 3 bullet wounds, 2 to the stomach, and 1 to the back of the head. The body was displayed as proof of what had been accomplished, as a message to the organization that had just lost its most capable military commander, and as confirmation that no level of seniority within the Taliban provided immunity from what Task Force 42 and its partners were capable of. The aftermath was immediate and measurable. 7 of Dadullah's senior commanders abandoned the insurgency entirely following his death. Taliban leadership retreated to Pakistan. His younger brother Mullah Dadullah was named as replacement and would subsequently be removed from Taliban command by the movement's own leadership, replacing a man who had twice been relieved for excessive violence with a man who prompted the same response. Andy McNabb, discussing the strategic consequences publicly. There was no longer any aspiration to take the fight to Europe and the United States, exactly as Dadullah had wanted. That specific ambition died with him in southern Helmand. Operation Tetris had not been a mid-level strike against a bomb-making facilitator. It had been the removal of the Taliban's most senior military commander in a direct action mission that could not be executed from altitude, requiring hours of close fighting in a civilian-populated area, conducted without a civilian casualty, in precisely the circumstances where civilian casualties were the central operational and political constraint. Task Force 42 had demonstrated what it could accomplish when the target and the difficulty were both at their absolute maximum. As the operations continued, because the mission continued, and the list did not shorten itself in response to what had been accomplished. In spring 2008, a battalion of United States Marines arrived in Helmand to reinforce the British presence. The following spring, 11,000 additional Marines arrived as the first wave of President Obama's surge. By mid-2010, the American force in southern Afghanistan had grown to more than 19,000 personnel. Ambassador Karl Eikenberry reportedly described the international security force as feeling like 42 nations rather than 41, because the Marines operated so independently from their coalition partners that they had effectively created their own command environment within the shared province. The Marines were exceptional. Their culture of physical intensity, combat aggression, and professional discipline is not performance for an outside audience. It is the genuine product of an institution that has been building fighting men since 1775, and that takes the task as seriously as any military organization in human history. A Marine who arrived in Helmand in 2008 or 2009 had been through a demanding selection process, a comprehensive training pipeline, and a culture that required individual excellence as the price of membership. They were not observers who lacked standards. They were observers whose standards were among the highest in the entire conventional military world. They were not prepared for what they watched. The Special Forces Support Group was documented operating alongside U.S. Marines in Helmand on multiple occasions. United States Marine Corps imagery from 31st August 2013 shows Marines from Gulf Company, 2nd Battalion 8th Marines, alongside British soldiers and Afghan commandos, exiting a Sikorsky CH-53 EC Stallion heavy-lift helicopter at Camp Bastion during a joint interdiction operation. The operational proximity was real, sustained across years, and created the specific conditions under which American infantry, with no prior exposure to British Special Forces, could observe them work at close range, across multiple operations, in the same contested province. The 6-minute figure in this script is not attributed, in any accessible operational record, unto a single specific documented incident with a verified timestamp and a named location. What the record contains is everything that makes it a reasonable expression of a documented standard rather than a dramatic invention. 90 compound entries per month across the coalition's special forces in late 2009. Task Force 42 conducting its proportional share of those entries. Operators who had been entering similar structures in Afghanistan since 2001, at a tempo that amounted to multiple entries per week for those on active rotation. Men who had passed a selection specifically designed to produce function under conditions of maximum physical and psychological stress, and men trained in the close-quarter battlehouse for years in the specific discipline of moving through a building fast enough to remove the time available for a defender to formulate any meaningful response. When those men entered a compound, the time from breach to clearance was measured in minutes rather than the longer period that conventional military doctrine requires and conventional military training produces. When American Marines watched that happen from outside the cordon and looked at their watches and looked at each other, the number did not match any reference point in their experience. The phrase that emerged, used in the direct way that professionals use when they observe performance that lies beyond their available benchmarks, was the phrase this script began with. It is not a compliment offered to an ally out of diplomatic courtesy. It is a professional assessment made by men whose own standard is exceptional. And the assessment was correct. What the Marines did not know is that the men they were watching had been built by an institution that their own most elite counterpart was explicitly founded to replicate. Delta Force was created in 1977 by Colonel Charlie Beckwith, who had served as an exchange officer with 22nd SAS during the Malayan emergency, who had returned to the United States with a detailed report arguing that the U.S. Army had no equivalent capability and needed one urgently, and who spent years being resisted before he was finally permitted to build what he had seen. When Beckwith built Delta Force, and he built it as close to the SAS model as the American military structure would permit. The selection philosophy, the four-man patrol concept, the emphasis on individual initiative over hierarchical instruction, the American unit that defines the American standard for special operations performance was itself the student. The Israeli Sayeret Matkal, the French 1st Marine Infantry Parachute Regiment, the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, the lineage of institutions shaped by the British template, runs across the Western Alliance and beyond it. The stun grenade, the purpose-built live-fire training house, the doctrine of close-quarter battle as a specialized discipline distinct from standard infantry fighting. These were British inventions, refined at Hereford, adopted and adapted everywhere else. When Marines watched British operators clear a compound and reached for language adequate to the observation, they were watching the original. Their reaction echoes the conclusion that Charlie Beckwith had reached in the Malayan jungle 40 years earlier, standing beside men who operated in a way his own army had not yet learned to produce. The assessment had not changed across 4 decades and 2 generations of special operations evolution. It had simply acquired a new witness. But the complete record of what Task Force 42 and 22nd SAS did in Afghanistan is not contained in the operational successes. It is not contained in Bahram Chah, or in the sustained targetless campaign, or in the professional admiration of Allied observers who ran out of adequate language. It contains something else, on something that any honest accounting of what the SAS was and what it did in this war is obligated to include, because the evidence for it is documented. The investigations into it are ongoing, and the people who were harmed by it have not yet received formal acknowledgement of what was done to them. In November 2010, a specific SAS squadron deployed to Helmand province for a 6-month tour that lasted until May 2011. BBC Panorama's 4-year investigation, drawing on operational after-action reports and testimony from serving and former military personnel, found that the squadron killed at least 54 Afghans in circumstances that were, by the consistent assessment of officers who reviewed the reports at the time, suspicious. After-action reports showed that other officers were surprised at the casualty rate being inflicted in apparent firefights when no SAS troops reported injuries. The bullet holes found at compound scenes after the raids were consistently low in the walls, indicating to the officers who examined them that targets had been kneeling or prone when shot, rather than standing and presenting a threat. No SAS casualties were reported across any of the raids in question. The total number of people killed by the squadron during that 6-month tour ran into triple figures. A former intelligence officer attached to the unit described the operational culture of the period in terms that required direct quotation. It was all about the stats. When numbers were read at the morning meeting at NATO headquarters, they wanted the task force to have high numbers. It was seen as a metric of success. Senior Special Forces officers told the subsequent inquiry that the regiment, arriving from aggressive high-tempo operations in Iraq, was being driven by kill counts, the number of dead achievable in each operation. 2 toddlers were shot in a bed alongside their parents during a night raid in Nimruz province. The incident was not reported to military police. An Afghan commando officer was so angered at a February 2011 meeting with SAS personnel over conduct he and his colleagues considered unlawful, that he reportedly reached for his pistol. Afghan commando units declined on multiple occasions to patrol alongside the SAS because of what they had observed and could not be persuaded to ignore. General Sir Mark Carleton Smith, who headed United Kingdom Special Forces during the period under examination, was briefed on the alleged killings and did not pass the evidence to military investigators. The Royal Military Police investigation launched in 2014 into more than 600 alleged offenses, was obstructed within the British military and ended in 2019 without prosecution. The independent inquiry relating to Afghanistan, examining whether approximately 80 Afghan civilians were unlawfully killed by British forces between 2010 and 2013, opened at the Royal Courts of Justice in October 2023. It is not concluded. The Ministry of Defense stated that British troops served with courage and professionalism in Afghanistan. That statement is true. It is not the whole truth. The timeline is the most important element of understanding what the full record contains. The Dadullah operation was May 2007. The Sustained Task Force 42 campaign against the mid-level network ran through 2008 and 2009. The compound clearances that produced the American reaction occurred across 2008 to 2010. The period under inquiry begins in November 2010. These are sequential chapters of the same story, not competing versions of it. The force that accomplished what this script has described is the same institution the inquiry is examining. Both things are simultaneously true. Neither cancels the other, and a history that presents only one of them is not a history. The question of how a force moves from one reality to the other is the most important question the full record raises. The answer involves sustained operational tempo beyond what any human institution can maintain without degradation, a regimental culture that had never been subject to adequate external scrutiny, the specific metric of kill counts applied to a force whose identity had been built on not counting, and the consequences of deploying men trained to function at the extreme edge of human capability into conditions where the oversight that should govern that capability was systematically insufficient. None of this excuses what the evidence indicates occurred. None of it reduces the weight of what was done to the people it was done to. It makes the history honest. David Stirling wrote 2 pages in a Cairo hospital bed in July 1941. He argued that the right small number of precisely selected, specifically trained men could achieve what mass could not. He was right in the Libyan desert. He was right in every conflict his institution entered across the 8 decades that followed. He was right in Helmand in 2007, when C Squadron flew by helicopter to a compound near the Pakistani border and removed the most dangerous military commander the Taliban had in the field. And the institution he founded was capable, in different conditions and under different pressures, of producing something far removed from what his founding principle intended. That is what the British SAS was in Afghanistan. That is what it did, and what it cost to be capable of doing it, and what it is still being asked to answer for. The men who made those compound clearances look like something the Americans had no language for, are not named in this script. The regiment does not name them publicly, and this script respects that choice. The men who are alleged to have shot unarmed people in their beds are not named either, because the inquiry has not concluded and the evidence has not been tested before a court. What can be named is the institution, the selection, the training, the operational record in full, the killing house and the long drag, and Bahram Chah and the shadow that fell across the same force in the years that followed. Now you know.